They've run Scotland for 17 years, but now amidst a collapsed power-sharing agreement, the SNP face huge pressure as a minority government with another new leader and First Minister. To discuss that and more, we're in Aberdeen, the oil capital of Europe, now grappling with the challenge of moving away from fossil fuels. So plenty of debate with our audience here, who reflect the electoral picture across Scotland. Welcome to Question Time. Tonight, as always, a wide range of views. One of the most senior figures in the Scottish National Party, Stephen Flynn. He's not in the Scottish Government, now under new management, of course, but does lead his party's 43 MPs at Westminster and is seen by some as a possible First Minister of the future. Meghan Gallacher is Deputy Leader of the Scottish Conservatives. The UK party may be in power at Westminster, but are the second biggest in the Scottish Parliament, with around a quarter of the seats. One man who definitely wants to be First Minister is Sarwar, who leads Scottish Labour. His party is third largest at Holyrood and has 2 Scottish MPs at Westminster, but polls suggest that could be all about to change. And Iain Dale will, I suspect, never be First Minister. Don't think he wants to be, but he is an award-winning radio host, podcaster and columnist and writer. He's written or edited more than 50 books, mostly on politics, but occasionally football. He presents the evening show on LBC, and we are awaiting Alex Salmond, of course, a former First Minister. He'll be here any minute. So, as I say, Alex Salmond is just running a bit late, but he's going to be here any second. Welcome to our panellists. Welcome to our audience here in Aberdeen. Great to see you. And, of course, welcome to you at home. You can follow the programme either on BBC Sounds, on BBC iPlayer, or you can follow the debate on social media as well. Now, we will, when Alex arrives, have 5 panellists, and I know you have got lots to say, so I would ask you to be reasonably brief in your answers, if you would. Let's have our first question now from Susan Banks.
Good evening, panel. When John Swinney offered to be First Minister for everyone in Scotland last week, does that include all those who do not want independence?
Stephen Flynn.
Yes, of course it does. And, you know, there's an important point to be made here, because whilst the SNP has had some internal turmoil, and I think it's fair to say that that's been the case, and nobody would seek to say otherwise, certainly within our party, the reality is that the challenges we've faced pale into complete insignificance in comparison to the challenges that the public have faced, with the cost of living crisis being at the forefront, the fact that people haven't been able to afford their energy bills, their mortgage bills, or indeed their food bills. And that cuts right across society. And in these times, what we need is serious politicians. And John Swinney is most definitely a serious politician. He's someone who's well respected across the political divide. He brings a huge amount of experience to the Scottish Government, and he, of course, will seek to act in the best interests of every single person who lives here.
I mean, he certainly does bring a lot of experience, because he was First Minister before and then you got rid of him.
Well, he wasn't.
So why do you want him back this time?
Well, he wasn't.
A leader, sorry, leader, forgive me, leader of the SNP. And so why do you want him back?
Because
he wasn't good enough then. Why is he good enough now?
Because John Swinney is by far the best candidate to take on the role of First Minister. And may I say, by the way, the contrast in the words of John Swinney over the course of the last couple of weeks, with the comments of the Prime Minister on Monday, when he labelled half of the population of Scotland as extremists. He compared those people in Scotland who believe in the democratic right for Scotland to be an independent nation to be akin to individuals in China, Iran, and North Korea.
So let me just for those of you, I'm just going to say what he said, just so that people don't know.
But let me finish. The Prime Minister demeaned his office. He demeaned himself, and it's a measure of the man, his small stature in public life, that he did so.
So just for those who are not familiar, the words he used are Scottish nationalists are even trying to tear our United Kingdom apart, and that was at the end of quite a long discourse about, as you say, China, Iran, and various other things. Alex Salmond is in the building. Would you like to come in, Alex? Thank you very much for joining us. Alex, I'll come to you in a minute. Meghan, you were just trying to say something there.
Well, I mean, John Swinney is continuity candidate 2.0. He has already said that he is going to make the general election page 1, line 1 about independence. That is not speaking to people who do not want independence. They want people to be focused on the real priorities that impact Scotland just now. That's our NHS, that's our education system, that's our justice system. It's not independence. That's not what people are saying to me on the doorsteps. It should really be about the people's priorities, and that is not what the SNP are focused on. They've never been focused on it, and they never will be.
OK. Let's hear from Orange, the man there in the blue shirt.
Is the return of a former leader to the SNP just a demonstration of the lack of talent in the SNP?
OK. And let me hear... Susan, you asked the question. What's your view on this?
I agree with Meghan. It's definitely takes priority within the SNP, and we have so many other major issues that are concerning us right now.
And what would your priorities be?
Definitely the NHS, education is a must, and the cost of living, obviously, without
Alex,
question.
let me come to you and let me read the question again, because obviously you missed it. Susan was saying, when John Swinney offered to be First Minister for everyone in Scotland last week, does that include all those who do not want independence?
Well, yes, it does, and I'm sure that's the way John will approach things. I mean, by definition, you couldn't have, if it wasn't possible to be a First Minister for everyone, any First Minister with a view on the constitutional question would be either a unionist representing 50% of the population or a nationalist representing 50% of the population. But of course, there's so many issues you can approach in a way that embraces the whole community. I take a different view from the lady who's just spoken. I don't think the SNP have lost its way because of a concentration on independence. In fact, I think they've lost their way on independence, which, after all, they won an election on a mandate to get another referendum to decide the independence question. I think they lost their way by getting taken up in the highways and byways of identity politics and into all sorts of issues which, you know, frankly, no society in Western Europe has managed to find an answer to. And it was that absorption of parliamentary time and bandwidth in these sort of issues of self-identification which took, I think, the eye off the ball of housing, education, health and jobs above all, which is what any First Minister, SNP or any other party should be doing in the Scottish Parliament as an absorption of their time. So I don't think it's John Swinney's fanatical pursuit of independence that's been the problem. I think it's the SNP's failure to deliver independence is the problem.
Man there in the shirt and tie, blue shirt and tie.
It flabbergasts me that Labour and Conservative are surprised that the SNP want independence. That's one of their main policies. So why every time they mention it do you say, oh, leave that alone, leave that alone? That's one of the reasons they're there. That's what they want.
All right. Well, Anna's coming to answer that in a minute. Yes, the woman in the glasses.
Hi, yes. I completely agree with the last person, actually, and I don't agree with what Meghan had said. You know, this government has been here and has, you know, sort of lifted so many children out of poverty. There's so much socialist values that you get through the SNP being in government. And to the greater extent, I mean, I know Annas is sitting there and he's representative of Scottish Labour, but, you know, sort of in terms of the kind of principles of socialism and looking after people, that has been the way over the last several years with the SNP. And, you know, yes, independence is really, really important, and I support it, surprise, surprise. But I don't think that has actually taken away from the care that they have for everybody in the country.
Annas.
Can I just say right from the start that I don't agree with Rishi Sunak that half the population are extremists. Look, I don't support independence. I don't support a referendum right now, but I completely respect those who want to argue the case or may believe in independence. I actually want to look at the underlying factors which drive many of the people to support independence. Of course, for some, for example, Alex and Stephen, it will be an identity issue, a national identity issue. But for some people that were driven towards independence, it was because they didn't believe that this UK Tory government was working for them. I completely agree on that. I think they have been an extremist government that have failed every single corner of our country, including Scotland. They want change, and for many people, they thought the only vehicle for change was that escape route around independence. But I think there is a different kind of change. I don't think there is a majority in our country right now for independence. I don't think there's a majority or a consistent majority that want a referendum, but neither is there a majority for the status quo. There is an overwhelming majority in our country for change, and we have to advocate and deliver that change. On John Swinney in particular, look, let's not pretend this is day one of an SNP government. John Swinney has been at the heart of every SNP decision for the last 17 years. He's been at the heart of the SNP leadership for the last 40 years. He's one of the architects of divisive politics in Scotland, and on his watch, we have seen 820,000 Scots stuck on an NHS waiting list, including 85,000 in this part of Scotland alone. We've got 104 people, living in fuel poverty in Aberdeen alone, even though we are an energy-rich part of the world. All of this happening on both the SNP and the Tories' watch. So this is not change, this is continuity, it's more of the same. And if we were being true to ourselves, what happened to the democratic principle that people rightly said in the SNP about a second unelected leader being imposed on the electorate without an election when Rishi Sunak took over from the disastrous Liz Truss? Why does that democratic principle not apply to Scotland? Why has there been a stitch-up in the SNP to impose their own candidate as First Minister, which is all about managing what happens inside the SNP and nothing to do with running our country, which is being destroyed by 14 years of the Tories and 17 years of the SNP?
Let me just let Iain come in first. Iain.
A friend of mine said to me the other day, you do realise the only reason they've invited you on Question Time is because you're a John Swinney lookalike.
I said that had not crossed my mind, but OK.
See? Look, John Swinney is there to govern for the whole of Scotland, whoever is First Minister, as Alex completely understands. You govern for everybody. But the reason he is in his position is because the young cardinals, Stephen, Kate Forbes, one or two others, decided to elect an old pope because they know that he will only be there for a couple of years and then it will be their turn. That's what happened, in my view. I think that if you're the SNP and you genuinely want to achieve independence, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with wanting your country to be independent. The best way to do that is to show that you can govern well. And to the lady at the back who was talking about, well, the SNP are socialist and want to care for people, etc. Well, there are plenty of people in Scotland who would question that when they look at the record of the Scottish NHS or the Scottish education system, where the results, the outcomes, are below the rest of the United Kingdom. So if you want independence, you've got to demonstrate that you can govern well. And I think there are many examples where the SNP have failed to govern well. But as somebody on the right of politics, I'm quite unusual in that I describe myself as independence curious. In that I'm a quarter Scottish. If I lived in Scotland, I think I would be tempted to support independence. And I remember saying to Alex many, many years ago when I interviewed him that the big mistake the SNP have made is not to have a broad tent SNP, but to keep it as a left-wing party. And if you think about it, Scottish Tories could be seen as more nationalist than any other party, and yet the SNP has never reached out to the right of Scottish politics.
Well, the mistake I made was not signing up Iain Dale. I should have done it at the time.
Well, let's
Can I just say one thing about this extremism thing? Very briefly. You know, when I heard, I was in Berlin at a conference, and I heard this extremist remark by Rishi Sunak, and I sort of thought, you know, that's just a drowning Prime Minister thrashing about, pay no attention. But actually, I've read now the whole speech, Fiona. And this is this wasn't an off-the-cuff, silly remark. And I'll tell you why it's so important. There's the real democratic point here. Scottish nationalism in its modern form has been around for 100 years, as a representative force in Parliament for 50 years. In that century, not a single person has lost their life arguing for or against Scottish independence. Nobody has had so much as a nosebleed arguing for or against Scottish independence. And it's been civic, it's been democratic, it's been embraced whether victory or defeat. That is an incredibly valuable thing. How dare Rishi Sunak describe people pursuing national self-determination as extremists? It's outrageous.
I have
Meghan.
I've got to come in here because the independence referendum of 2014 was not civic, it was not joyous, and I'll give you my Twitter if you ever want to have a look at the abuse I get for simply being pro-UK. So please don't say that the independence referendum was civic and joyous. It certainly wasn't, and it's created divisions that have lasted since 2014 until now. But those divisions are still there because of the push for...
And you don't think the Conservative Party causes divisions in society?
So, Stephen...
You don't.
First of all, okay, sorry, Alex. First of all, the comments that Anos was making. Also, so are we sitting with a young cardinal here who wants to push the Pope off his perch?
Well, the interesting aspect in all of that, John Swinney's age is often mentioned, but he, of course, is younger than Keir Starmer. And,
yes, but, but there has also been talk about him retiring from politics on more than one occasion. So, and he's also talked about, maybe stepping back. So
I'm not sure John Swinney's ever retired from
politics. Well, not
politics,
retired, but he has talked about stepping back. That's definitely the case.
Yeah, but cometh the hour, cometh the man, and we have serious challenges that we face in society, and we need serious individuals with experience to come forward in the public interest to deal with them, and John has done that, and I think that is something to be welcomed. Now, there's a couple of things I just want to touch on briefly. Firstly, Anis seems to be of the view that there should be an election in Scotland because Holyrood has elected a new First Minister.
That was your view. That was your view on Rishi Sunak.
Of course, but the difference is that in Westminster, and I sit there, we don't vote in Westminster for a Prime Minister. In Holyrood, you do. Just as, incidentally, you do in Wales, where the Labour Party just elected a new First Minister after Mark Drakeford stood.
OK, so Nicola Sturgeon said on Sunak's appointment as PM, of course there should be a general election. Okay, we're not talking about a general election here in Holyrood, obviously, but the governance of any country cannot simply be a revolving door that one party gets picked time and time again. Sturgeon, Yousaf, Swinney.
And that is the difference between the Westminster system and the devolved governments in Labour-run Wales.
So it can be a revolving door here,
SNP
but just not down in Westminster.
It is the system that we operate within.
Do you realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Ian, it is the system that we operate within.
But yes, look, if you're criticising that system, presumably you're equally critical of this system.
But can I do something which is much more important than that? And that's to reflect upon what Anis's other point was, that what we are talking about here is politics in the run-up to a general election. And the public's priorities matter. They are the economy. They want to see the public being on the receipt of investment in their public services, in their NHS, rejecting the austerity agenda that's came out of Westminster for the last 14 years. They want to see investment in net zero. They want to see alignment with the single market. They want to see
why is less being spent on the
this.
Scottish NHS this year than it was last year?
So there's been a...
The only part of the UK...
That is not true.
It is true.
No, it's not true.
Absolutely
it is not the
I've
case.
looked at the figures this afternoon. I know it is true.
There's a 3% uplift in Scotland's NHS budget in comparison to a
1.6 billion
in comparison to a 0.8% cut in England.
Not in real terms. If you are going to really sit there and say that there's more money being spent on the NHS, it is just simply not true.
So Scotland's NHS is receiving a record amount of money, and it is an increase in comparison to what's happening in England. Our nurses are paid more than anywhere else on these isles. There is junior doctor strikes happening right now in England. There is no junior doctor strikes happening in Scotland at this moment.
So why are the waiting lists so bad?
Taken by the SNP.
If it's also great, why are the waiting lists so bad?
When it comes to our A&E system at the moment, we have better waiting times than anywhere else on these isles.
But you've not hit your targets for years,
when it comes to cancer waiting times, they're better than anywhere else on these isles. The reality is that we have
worse.
Hold on a minute.
The outcomes are worse.
The reality is that we have huge challenges within our NHS, but Scotland's NHS is rightly performing better than anywhere else on these isles. And I sit in the Westminster Parliament and hear politicians from across these isles decry what is happening. They don't do that in Scotland.
The outcome of our NHS crisis is almost 50% of the hip and knee replacements that are happening in our country right now are happening privately because of the waits in the NHS. There are literally people mortgaging their homes and borrowing money from their loved ones to pay for hip and knee replacements. Stop trying to blame somebody else. It's always somebody else's fault. Take responsibility. After 17 years of this SNP government, 830,000 of our fellow Scots are on
the woman here in the glasses.
Instead of focusing on the inter-party politics of it, why don't we let the people decide and hold a second referendum?
OK. Man there in the yellow shirt.
One thing that's already been alluded to is the fact that I think lots of people in Scotland, when it comes to general election, will wonder how to vote because of the status quo of two governments that they question now the decisions that have been made to. But as with the previous question, we've heard about calling and having another referendum, but we know from the Supreme Court ruling that that can only happen with the agreement from Westminster, and I can't see that that will happen by 2029.
OK, all right. I have a feeling this is a topic we will return to. Surprise, surprise, every time we come to Scotland. And very important it is too. So I'm going to move on for now. Before I do, I just want to say that next week, Question Time is in Coventry, and the week after that, we're in Epsom. So if you live in or around either of those two places, Coventry or Epsom, you'd like to come be part of the audience, like this one here in Aberdeen, go to the Question Time website, follow the instructions there, and hopefully we will see you in either of those two places. Right, let's take our next question from Morag McVeigh.
Good evening, panel. Do you think that the Scottish Government should follow Westminster's lead and stop the teaching of gender ideology as fact in our schools?
So the government at Westminster has introduced new guidance for consultation on sex education in England that includes, amongst other things, a ban on sex education for under 9s, but also that pupils in England should not be taught about what they call the contested theory of gender identity. Meghan, as the Conservative here, what is the contested theory of gender identity?
So I think this stems from the recently published Cash Review, which was a clear-cut, evidence-based report that outlined concerns relating to how gendered care was conducted in NHS England. But of course, there are similarities with NHS England and what happens up here in Scotland. Now, I spent a full week in the Scottish Parliament trying to get Scottish Government ministers to give a statement as to whether they would implement 32 recommendations of the Cash Review, so we did gender care better in Scotland. So we're making sure that young people were supported if they were experiencing gender distress.
But the question from Morag is about should the government follow Westminster's lead and stop the teaching of gender ideology as fact? The government has talked about the contested theory of gender identity. I'm not sure how much that means to everyone. I just wonder if you would define it for us so we can at least know what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So it's age-appropriate materials in schools. So it's making sure...
But what is the contested theory of gender identity?
Well, I think
this is the government policy, so what is it?
I think it's in relation to trans ideology and gender, if you are experiencing gender distress. So that would be, you know, if it was a girl experiencing gender distress wanting to be a boy or vice versa. But I think the move is reasonable. I think we need to be looking at something similar here in Scotland. I think we need to make sure that what we are teaching in our schools is age-based, so we're not teaching...
So do you think Scotland should follow Westminster's lead on this?
I do. I do think we need to look at this seriously. And in fact, actually, in Parliament this week, I was speaking to families who've had negative impacts surrounding gender care, and that, of course, extends into our education system. So yes, we absolutely should be looking at this. OK, so just for those of you who want to know the government's definition of gender identity, the UK government calls it a contested belief. It is a sense a person may have of their own gender, whether male, female or another category such as non-binary. This may or may not be the same as their biological sex. Many people do not consider that they or others have a gender identity at all, and they're saying that this is a contested belief. Do you think, Annas, that the Scottish Government should follow Westminster's lead on this?
Look, I think we've got to handle this really, really sensitively because it generally impacts on people's health and well-being. I think we have to be expert-led, and that's why I welcome the Cash Review. I think the Cash Review should be implemented in full. And in terms of what happens in our classrooms, it has to be age-appropriate. Again, it has to be expert-led.
I mean, what the guidance is saying is irrespective of what age you are, that it is the government in Westminster is describing it as a contested belief and it shouldn't be taught at all, no matter what age you are.
Well,
would you suggest Scotland follows that lead?
Look, of course it has to be facts-led, it has to be expert-led, it has to be age-appropriate, classrooms have to be properly resourced, and those, particularly young people that have issues around mental health, that needs to be properly resourced in terms of access to services. I think we also have to be alive to the fact that our young people, in the age of smartphones, in the age of the conversations they have with their own friends and family, will get access to conversations that adults shouldn't pretend aren't happening amongst children and young people themselves. So I think we've got to be really careful about what we're doing in our classrooms.
So would you say
There'll
not?
be-
I'm just trying to say not. Just in terms of Morek's question,
I think age
should the
appropriate-
government follow the at any age? You're not going to. If the government guidance goes ahead at any age, they won't be followed.
I don't think
They
we
won't
should
be
try
taught.
and mask from our children what is the lived reality for many people out there in the real world. Look, not every family that's involved in any classrooms is going to be the traditional household. There'll be lots of same-sex couples, etc., mixed families in these schools. And therefore, I think expert-led, properly resourced classrooms and age-appropriate has to be the right way. And actually, crucially, everything that's taught in our schools should be openly accessible to the parents to understand what's happening and what's being taught to their children. I think that is really, really important too.
Morek, should we just come back to you for a minute, because you asked the question. Morek, just so the microphone can... Just stick your hand up again so the microphone can find you.
I think it should be stopped. I don't think it's right to tell children that it's possible to be born in the wrong body. It's nothing to do with mixed, diverse family types. Don't tell children that they're born in the wrong body.
The woman at the front here in the green jacket. Yes.
So I teach every day in a classroom.
Oh, good, because I was going to ask if there are any teachers here.
Yeah,
so
14 years here. Obviously, I'm not from here originally, but sometimes I'm all young people have. And if I have to stop and think and can't, I don't know where the young people are supposed to go for information. Surely it should be me as a trusted adult and someone...
Okay. Have we got any... Can I hear from any other teachers here? Because I think there's more than one. Yes, right at the very back in the red top, yeah. What's your view on this?
But couldn't it be that the information is provided for the students to have a safe space to discuss it, and that it's made optional because this is a very personal topic that they might want to approach with their family and not necessarily in the wider context of the classroom? They might not be comfortable talking about it in the classroom as well. So couldn't it be that there's a safe space provided within the institutions so that these students or pupils can discuss it if they so wish, but at the same time that parents may have some concern, can maybe opt out of those types of sessions, informational sessions?
Okay, so have it optional, as you say. I mean, Iain, I was listening to to Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, down in Westminster. She's talking only about England, and Stephen, I'll come to you because I know there's a review happening here in Scotland as well. And she was talking about... She was asking what evidence is there that this is a problem. She said, well, I've seen education information that's talked about 72 genders and children are asked to place themselves on that spectrum. I've not seen that, but she was saying that she had. Morek's question, should the Scottish Government follow Westminster's lead and stop the teaching of gender ideology as fact?
If you want to put it in those terms, yes, I think it should be stopped. But young people always...
Well, that's the term she was putting in, not that I am. Yeah.
No, indeed. But young people always have questions. Everyone in this audience, when we were growing up, whether we were 9, whether we were 11, whether we were 13, at some point, we all had questions. Now, in an ideal world, your parents would be able to answer those questions, but we don't live in an ideal world, and there are many parents that just will not go into this area, whether it's gender identity or just general sex education. So therefore, it's left to the teachers. Now, what I don't want to see is a repeat of what happened in 1988 when Section 28 was brought in, and teachers weren't even allowed to mention the word homosexuality. Now, we don't want that to be here. If young people have got questions about gender identity or they have personal issues, then they should be able to approach a teacher like the lady in the front row for advice or whatever.
I think the government's not necessarily suggesting that wouldn't happen, but they're saying it shouldn't be taught. That's what they're saying.
Well, I think it's a very... if I was a teacher, I wouldn't find that very acceptable. And the problem here, in part, with sex education in general, is that governments are always years behind developments. So when you and I were at school, I mean, pornography would be a sort of dirty magazine. You couldn't watch it on a phone or anything. But we know that 8-year-olds, was it 50% of 9-year-olds have actually seen a pornographic film? I mean, that's horrific. So therefore, if you try and sweep this under the carpet and say 9-year-olds shouldn't actually be taught that this is wrong in school, I think that's a problem. But there is a solution. And I don't want to see young people today experience what I did in school, where you had the head of needlework and the head of geography doing the sex education. Neither of them wanted to do it. Neither of them really knew anything about it. And all we learnt was that Mr... I better not mention his name.
I can't wait to hear what you're going to say next.
Well, all he would talk to us about was the fact that he would have sex with his wife every Saturday night.
Oh, my goodness. That was your teacher?
Yeah. And this was the level of sex education in 1978.
And I understand you so much better.
Oh, my goodness.
I do have a solution to this, Fiona, very, very briefly. The solution is to have professionals teach sex education. Not in every school. You have a band of sex educators going from school to school to school and doing it properly. And the teachers in those schools will be very relieved.
Just to reassure you, apparently I'm being told it's 50% of 13-year-olds have seen some element of pornography. Not that's that reassuring, but at least it's not 9-year-olds. Yes, the man in the blue shirt with the glasses in the middle there.
I think I quite agree with what Westminster is saying. We shouldn't be playing politics with everything. We should allow children to live their life. When they get to the age of accountability, they should be able to decide what they want to be.
Right, and not be discussing it in the classroom.
We should, at some point, not 2-3 years, you know, we shouldn't be pushing into the truth. At least when they get to the age of accountability, they should be able to decipher, this is what is good for me, this is what I want to be, rather than us pushing it to them.
Do you mean 18 by that, the age of accountability?
17, 18, yeah.
17, 18, something like that. Okay, and the man right at the very back. Yeah.
Yeah, I think age appropriateness is definitely a concern, but I think also we have to differentiate between discussion and taught. I'm not clear whether the proposals that it's not discussed at all. I'd be very concerned if there was no opportunity for children to discuss these things in a safe place.
Okay. Stephen.
So I have 2 very young kids, one of whom will be starting school this year. And I know for a fact that he is going to have very many questions over the years to come. I, like most parents, want to think that he's going to come and speak to his mum and dad about those big issues. But he's not. He's not going to come and speak to us about everything that's happening in the world and in his life. And what I would like to know and to have is the comfort that when he goes to school and he is around our fantastic educators, that they are empowered to be able to speak to him about the big challenges that he faces in his life. I don't know what those challenges are going to be. I don't know what his future looks like. I hope it's great, but the reality is I don't know. And the people who spend the most time with him in his life over the coming years will be the people in the schools in this city that we are sat in today. And I am confident in their judgment. And if they, as experts, feel that they should be in a position to help guide him on his journey in life and his younger brother when he goes to school too, I'm okay with that as a parent. And that might be contentious with some people.
And if you don't agree with it, you'd be okay with
it. But the world's not perfect, and I would rather he was speaking to a teacher than looking at something on a smartphone and thinking that's right.
Okay.
Yes, can I ask though, because again, I've got a young daughter, and I am genuinely concerned about the movements in terms of what's emerged following the cash review. And Stephen, I just want to know, do you support implementing the 32 recommendations of the cash review, given that it is evidence-based, given it's been led by an expert clinician? You know, I think this is really important. We need to get this right for our young children, and I think the gentleman was right. We need to let children be children.
So I unlike I think many politicians, have taken the time to read the CAS review.
Can I just tell people what it is, just in case they're not familiar with it? So, just in case you're familiar with the CAS review. So, the CAS review is something brought about as a result of what was going on, particularly at within the NHS and the Tavistock Institute in London, in terms of medication, all sorts of things happening in terms of trans, and it's a gender clinic specifically. And the CAS review came up with a whole load of recommendations, 32 as you say, but what it was basically saying was that the pendulum had swung too far in terms of just handing out medication and being perhaps too quick to go for gender reassignment surgery and that kind of thing, and the pendulum needed to swing back.
So when it comes to the CAS review, I've taken the time to read it. Not all the recommendations are relevant to Scotland, but that's not the main issue here. The main issue is the fact that there are recommendations which are relevant.
And you're being asked,
Scotland.
do you support them?
And as has been outlined by the Scottish Government, they're taking time to assess the implications of those recommendations with our health experts in
So we
Scotland.
don't know yet. You haven't decided whether you support them or not.
Hold on, let me finish. With our health experts in Scotland, and that is the right approach to take. For myself, as a point of principle, when a leading clinician comes forward with a report, which, having read it, I think is very clear in those recommendations which relate to Scotland, I would like to think that they will be implemented, but it is absolutely right that the government in Scotland takes the time working with experts to make sure that they're getting things right. Because what we're talking about here is people. And can I just be very brief here?
Really brief, Stephen, because Alex hasn't had a word yet.
So there's a story when it comes to trans ideology, which was spoken about by Lord Iain Duncan. He's a former Conservative member of the European Parliament. His brother died of ovarian cancer because he didn't have access to the healthcare that was required. Now, I hope Iain will forgive me for raising this, but he has done it publicly in the past. We are talking about a small group of people in society, and I think as a society, we should be empathetic to their needs.
Alex. So just to remind you of the question. Right. Should the Scottish Government follow Westminster's lead and stop the teaching of gender ideology, as Morag is putting it, as fact?
OK, can I start on the cash review, because you've been speaking about that for a few seconds?
Please start by answering the question, and then you can get on to the cash review.
Everybody else is not answering
I know, that's why I'm having at least a go with you if you can answer the question.
You're picking on me by making me answer the question. Outrageous. Well, OK, on teaching in schools, can I introduce a novel concept? Perhaps we should have more faith in the professionalism of the teaching profession, right? Because the Scottish education was built on having a professional teaching service, and we should rely rather more than that. The key point in your question is actually gender identification as fact. That's the question, as fact. You should not teach gender self-selection or gender identification as fact, because clearly it's not a fact. You can't select your gender just by saying, today I've decided to be a man, or today I've decided to be a woman. You can't do that. Today, something very interesting happened. A large number of people in the Scottish Green Party were expelled for saying that sex was a biological fact. But it's ridiculous. So when we come to what's taught in schools, you can't teach gender ID as a fact. I don't mind if people discuss gender ID, and I certainly don't mind if they discuss a report that's considered and scientifically based as Hilary Cass's review. Incidentally, one of the very few government documents, which is, when you go onto the internet, it's brilliant. It's absolutely easily accessible. It tells you exactly what the main recommendations are, gives you the background to the report. I commend it to everyone. It was the issue, incidentally, Fiona, which broke the SNP Green coalition. Because when the Green Party leader in Scotland said, when presented with the Cass review, oh, it's all propaganda, which was purely a ridiculous statement. This is a scientific-based report about the best way to treat children with the genuine condition of gender dysphoria. That's what it's about. And of course, its recommendations should be followed. There are one or two which wouldn't be directly applicable to Scotland, that's true. But the bulk of the recommendations and the sense of the report, the common sense of the report, should be grabbed by politicians as at last reintroducing rationality and scientific basis to this very, very difficult debate.
OK. Let me take another question. From Ian Cuthbert.
Is there a future for North Sea oil?
Right, of course, we are in the energy capital of Europe, here in Aberdeen. Anas, is there a future for North Sea oil?
Yes, absolutely. Oil and gas is going to play...
Why do you want to shut it down, Anas?
I don't, and if you let me answer the question, Stephen...
100,000 jobs your proposals will cost.
No, actually, our proposals give us 50,000 extra jobs. You're not in Westminster now, so you can leave the heckling for there, Stephen. The point here is that we have a genuine plan to meet the transition. People have had, so let me be really clear, there's no switching off of the tap, there's no cliff edge. Oil and gas will play a significant role for decades to come. And one of the reasons, and really important reasons, is if we are to meet our transition, then we need those involved in the oil and gas sector to be partners in helping us make those strategic investments so we can maximise the opportunities of the green revolution. And I can totally understand why people are nervous after 14 years of the Tories and 17 years of the SNP, where they've heard lots of promises before. Don't forget, Alec promised the Saudi Arabia of renewables that never was delivered. So I can understand the scepticism. But we have a plan which is partly GB Energy, a publicly owned energy generation company that will be headquartered right here in Scotland, that will help bring down people's bills and also create over 50,000 jobs here in Scotland.
But in terms of the future, Anna, but in terms of the future of North Sea oil, if, as Keir Starmer said, there's going to be no new drilling, presumably North Sea oil is eventually going to peter out.
So we have been really clear we have been really clear that we will honour all licences and we will honour them all for their full lifespan. And we will work together with the industry to make that a reality. We already know that the North Sea Basin is mature. We already know that oil and gas is going to have over the next period, and so therefore we have to work in partnership with those companies to make it a reality. And so that's the commitment we are really openly making, because if you look at, I said earlier on about fuel poverty, Aberdeen is the energy capital of the UK, and despite our energy-rich future, 1 in 4 people in this city are in fuel poverty. And that's why we're not going to make the same mistakes.
Okay, that's a different question.
A detailed plan that's going to deliver that transition and make sure we realise the full potential.
This is one of the few areas where the Labour Party have actually stated their policy. So what is it? They're going to extend the windfall tax to 78%. They're going to cut investment allowances in the North Sea. And Stephen is quite right. An expert report today said that by 2030, if that was followed through, and of course there's a big doubt there, because when did the Labour Party last follow through in an election pledge? But if it was followed through, that would mean 100,000 of the 200,000 jobs remaining in the oil and gas directorate would disappear. That's the situation.
Not true.
Now, well, I'm sorry. Well, what's
After
not true?
17 years.
Never mind the 17 years. Never mind the rest of it. Your policy. Well, if I could remember, when I stood down as First Minister, we were re-elected by the Scottish people in an absolute majority in a proportional parliament. So somebody should have been quite satisfied with the direction we were taking at that stage. But that is Labour's policy, to extend the windfall tax to 78%, to cut the investment allowances. If you do that, then you will lose half of the jobs in oil and gas, and you shall do it long before the tens of thousands of renewable jobs kick in. And incidentally, on your Great British Energy, the one, the investment already cut from, what was it, 27 billion it was to be, now it's to be 4 billion. What matters is who gets the revenues, not where the company played. I mean, we're in Aberdeen. We're folk in this audience. We're old enough to remember the British National Oil Corporation, settled by a Labour government in Scotland, privatised as Britoil and disappeared. What was the long-term benefit? The benefit from both oil and gas and renewables is the endowment effect, the billions, the 400 billion that's already disappeared onto Westminster, and the billions to come for renewables. And the way forward is to get a share for the Scottish people of these billions of wealth.
Woman there in the blue top. Yes, you.
In terms of your green revolution, who is going to protect the people of the Highlands and the people of North East Scotland from the looming pylon clearances, and who is going to protect our countryside from mass industrialisation?
Right, and you're talking about extra pylons in order to connect the grid to things like wind farms, that kind of thing?
It's catastrophic what's coming. Every acre of Angus, Aberdeenshire and the Highlands is going to be covered with BESS, pylons, hydrogen, ammonia,
there's a big campaign, I know, and a lot of objections to a plan to have, I think it's 70 miles worth of pylons in order to connect the grid.
No, it's 25% of Scotland. It's not just Kintor to Teeling. It's the Western Isles to Beauly, it's Spittal to Beauly, it's Beauly to Peterhead, and that's just the beginning. Off the back of that, there will not be an acre of countryside left to enjoy.
This is a really important...
Okay, hang on. Yeah.
So to address the initial question, I am very, very frustrated at what we are hearing, because we have a unionist politician who supports the Westminster Parliament that has taken in the best part of £400 billion from this city, saying that people are living in fuel poverty. They're living in fuel poverty because Scotland's resources have been wasted for decades by Westminster. And do you know what makes it worse? Do you know what makes it worse? The Labour Party, as it stands, will, as Alec has said, increase and extend the windfall tax, end incentives for exploration, and as such cost 100,000 jobs. And when they do that, they will be aligning that with their cut in from £28 billion to £5 billion in green energy. So the very people and the very investment that we need in order to protect jobs, our energy security and indeed our economy in the North East for the years to come will be frittered down the drain by the Labour Party. It is absurd. Anna should be apologising to each and every person in this city for their looming plans.
Absolutely nonsense, Stephen. And your own party has a presumption against any new oil and gas licenses. So I don't know why you're saying a different thing to this audience here to what your colleagues say when they're talking to other audiences elsewhere. But let me be this really clear. Take the Acorn project. You rightly expressed a frustration that the UK government did not back the Acorn project, which would be transformational.
You'll need to explain to people
for
who are
this part of the
familiar with
country.
it what it is.
Carbon capture and storage, one part of our transitional future. Really important for Grangemouth, really important here. We've committed to delivering the Acorn project if we have a UK Labour government. You don't welcome that. Onshore wind, offshore wind, hydrogen, carbon capture storage,
2007, Anna.
If you haven't realised, if you haven't noticed, there's a different party in government across the UK.
All right,
that's why we need change across the UK.
Hang on, because it's just a backwards one. And all the people who've got their hands up, not getting a word in edgeways, I quite like to hear what they've got to say. Almost at the very back, last row but one, you've got, I can't quite see what you're wearing, black T-shirt or something? Yes.
Alex and Stephen have said there that if we increased the windfall tax to 78%, it would risk 100,000 jobs. But economists have stated that if we were independent, it could risk up to 250,000 jobs. So if we're talking about protecting jobs, why are we calling for independence?
OK, all right. And in the white T-shirt there, you're 4 rows back from the back, yes.
Ask Stephen Flynn if you didn't think it was hypocritical that he's criticising Labour for their plans on oil, when until a couple of weeks ago his party were in coalition with another party that kind of wanted to get rid of oil altogether.
That's the point. What do you say to that?
It shouldn't come as a surprise to the young gentleman that I'm quite happy that we are no longer in coalition.
Yes, but you were, Stephen. You can hardly say, oh, well, that was, I didn't agree with it. You weren't saying that when you were in coalition.
And the important point here...
Hang on. You weren't saying that when you were in coalition. It's all very well to say now, actually, that was all rubbish.
In fairness, I think I was one of the few folk who was saying that, and I was criticised for doing so.
That's what the SNP was doing.
I know what my party was doing in order to secure the majority that was required within Holyrood. But look, there's an important point to be made here, and this is Aberdeen's future, this is Scotland's future. We need to make sure that we have investment in our renewable sector going forward, but that can only happen by maintaining the jobs that we currently have.
On the way to this venue this evening, I came by taxi from Aberdeen Airport, and I always think it's a good idea to ask the taxi drivers what they think are the main local issues. And without a hesitation, he said oil and gas. Because if Keir Starmer gets in, we're finished. That was his view, not my view, that was his view. And I think that's something, if you want to get Stephen out of his seat in Aberdeen, you're going to have to address Annas. But moving on to the substance of the issue, energy security is going to be one of the biggest political issues facing this country over the next 10 years. Liam Fox, I remember back in 2014, he said, come and have a cup of coffee with me. And I said, what do you want to talk about? I'll tell you when I get there. And he droned on for an hour about energy security. In 2014, I mean, I was losing the will to live by the end of this hour. But he was absolutely right. And what we have to do as a country is to have a balanced energy basket. We don't have coal anymore, but we do have other things, of which oil and gas are one. Now, people say, well, we shouldn't have any more North Sea oil and gas licences, which I think Labour say, and certainly I think the SNP have said well, OK, all right, I'll take your word for it. But the fact is, we are going to need oil and gas probably for the next 3 or 4 decades. And I know it takes 20 or 30 years for oil fields to be exploited properly. But if we're going to need it, other countries are going to need it. And people say, well, we can only use 20% of it, 80% will be exported, as if that's an argument for not going forward. It won't affect our ability to meet the net zero targets by 2050. So I do not understand, apart from people trying to virtue signal about their green credentials, why we still wouldn't have oil and gas as part of our energy basket. The SNP is totally against nuclear, which is one of the cleanest forms of energy that there is. In terms of carbon, nuclear is the way to go. Now, what
about the waste?
But because, well, we deal with that already. Other countries deal with it as if you think it's something that we can't do.
See, what's fascinating about the discussion, Meg, I need to bring you in, is obviously here we are in Aberdeen, so many jobs dependent on the oil and gas industry and many people that I know personally. This discussion outside Aberdeen and climate change comes up again week after week after week on Question Time. And we get people coming from the audience saying, what are we going to do about climate change? Why are we still so reliant on fossil fuels? Fascinating. I haven't heard any voices to that effect yet. Is there anyone here who wants to express their view? This man here in the black top.
So important that we get this right, not just for the planet, but also for the northeast of Scotland. So often the northeast of Scotland is forgotten about. The central belt and London get all of the funding, money, resources, and so many young people like me and my peers have moved away from this part of the world, which of course is the best part of this island, the northeast and the Highlands. So what are your parties going to do to make sure that we stay here and we invest and we work here and live here for the rest of our lives?
So, I mean, to pick up on the gentleman's point there, the North East, the Highlands, has become SNP's forgotten Scotland, and that is absolutely fact. When you talk about dualling essential roads, hasn't been done. When you look at rural healthcare...
Have you seen the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route? Did you come in that way?
Have you seen the A9?
Okay.
Hang
on. Okay, Stephen, you've had a long time talk. The question is there a future for North Sea oil, Meghan?
But if you actually look at the oil and gas sector, you know, I will be unapologetic when I say that myself and my party will always stand up for oil and gas workers in the North East. That is our bread and butter.
The tax.
Stephen, let her speak. Come on.
Yeah, hold on, Stephen. I'm the only woman on the panel. Please allow me a little bit of time to allow me to expand my argument. But in terms of what the UK Conservative Party would do, we've already committed to a new carbon capture area in the North East. That would, of course, bring more jobs. It will bring in billions of pounds. So that is just what the UK government is doing. We are steadfast on our commitment for oil and gas. And as I said, I will be completely unapologetic when I say that going into the election, but even right now, we will always stand up for oil and gas workers.
OK, Alex, I know you want to come in, but I want to take one more question. We've only got about 7 or 8 minutes left. A lot of you asked about this question, so I'm going to try and squeeze it in. Rachel Stewart, where are you? There you go.
What is the cause of and the solution to the UK's housing crisis?
Right. So this is an issue across the UK. This week, the Scottish Government declared a housing emergency in Scotland. Labour tried to do that 6 months ago. I don't think the SNP backed that one, but they've certainly gone for it now. Anas.
Look, it's a great question. The simple answer is we're not building enough homes, and we've got to get the house building numbers up here in Scotland. The reason why it's so important is we've got record levels of particularly young people living in temporary accommodation. Over 10,000 children in Scotland now don't have a home to call their own.
The question is, what's the cause and what's the solution?
So the cause, not enough homes. How do we get home building up? We've got to sort our planning system. Take up my city, Glasgow, as an example. The average planning application takes 78 weeks. In Glasgow, in Manchester, it's closer to 16 weeks. That's not an attractive place to come and do business as a result. We've got to sort our planning system. We've got to have greater regulation of our rents system rather than the flawed way that the Greens and the SNP pursued it, where actually house building fell. We're now at Thatcher levels of social home buildings here in Scotland as a result of decisions made by this SNP government. So more homes, attract the investment here, create the financial conditions for people to want to invest money here in Scotland, and that's how we address the housing emergency.
Man here, you had your hand up straight away.
So I stay in a small town not too far away from here, and the local council have objected and stopped the build of, I think, 200 to 300 homes because the local community wouldn't have enough green space. I think it would be 4% short on the green space it would be required to have for the community. And I just think the local council is causing a big problem with getting these homes up.
OK, we've only got 5 minutes. You're going to be quite brief. Stephen.
So firstly, Scotland's story over the course of the last 17 years when it comes to house building is one of success. When we look at per head of population...
You just declared a housing emergency yesterday.
Anas, would you allow me to finish?
It's a fair point.
Yes, and I'll come to explain why. I think I should be granted the opportunity to explain.
Stephen, fairness, you've interrupted everybody here, but OK, you go for it. I'm chairing this thing. That is my job, Stephen. Right, a short answer, please.
So per head of population, Scotland's built 40% more homes than in England. We've built 70% more homes than in Wales. The reason we're not able to continue with the levels of investment we would like is because there's been a £1.6 billion cut to Scotland's capital budget by the Westminster government, and that is compounded by the fact that
17 years.
And that is compounded by the fact that construction inflation is through the roof. So Scotland has an incredibly positive story in comparison to elsewhere.
But it's clearly got an emergency going on right now, as you have said. Iain.
The simple answer is obviously build more houses. I mean, if you've got a lack of supply and a huge demand, house prices are going to go up, and that's happening all over the UK, not just in Scotland. I've been really disappointed. I thought when Michael Gove became Housing Secretary that he would really shake up the system, the planning system, but he's failed to do that. Labour aren't really promising many more houses than the Conservatives are. I think 50,000 a year. Well, that's a drop in the ocean to what is needed. And I think the planning system clearly needs to be reformed. But also local councils, and I suspect this is the case in Scotland as well as England, tend to be very NIMBY-ish. They don't want a lot of new developments, and that because they say, well, their residents don't want them.
So their residents' view should be ignored more, do you think?
Well, not about ignored, but certainly sort of there should be more...
Let me come... I'm sorry.
Just one brief thing.
I've got 3 minutes left, so no. Okay. Meghan.
Thank you. So the SNP government were forced into declaring a housing emergency just yesterday in Parliament. And, of course, this is the start of a new way of Parliament, because beforehand they would just rely on their Green partners to vote through anything without having
Cause and solution, that's the question.
So, cause and solution. So I think we do need to build more houses, that's absolutely the case, but I think we also need to look at our rural communities, because we've got a massive issue just now with depopulation, and we need to make sure that we're getting people into rural communities, get our infrastructure up to make sure that those communities are thriving, to get people back into those areas.
Alex.
Thank you. The SNP cut the social housing budget by 200 million because the Green Party wanted to spend it on active travel. Now, active travel is really important, but it's not as important as roofs over people's heads. Nobody's mentioned the very obvious problem in the private sector, sky-high interest rates. I mean, you have to be what young couple can afford a house in Aberdeen with the state of interest rates at the present moment? And lastly, Scotland absolutely needs a vast expansion of socially rented housing. And the one way I can see to get the money in is to get it from the insurance companies and the pension funds with a government guarantee. You could be talking about access to billions in order to get a real substantial initiative in social housing, which is the most urgent priority for young Scots.
Woman at the back in the glasses.
Yes, hi. What about old houses, empty old houses? What's wrong with them instead of building new?
Right, OK. You want those... Man there in the... You've got black sweater on, I think. No, further back. That's it, yeah.
Just to second that point, there's huge swathes of unused units in Aberdeen itself, and we need to bring people back into our city.
Man here in the with the sunglasses, yeah.
Hi. So Anis touched upon the timescales in which it takes for planning applications to be determined. I'm actually a town planner myself, and I think one of the issues is that the profession is vastly under-resourced in this country. You know, in terms of Scotland itself, there's only one university, Dundee University, I believe, which actually teaches town planning as an undergraduate degree. So I think that you know, whichever government comes into power really needs to work with the Royal Town Planning Institute to try and create more funding to basically vastly improve the resources within the profession, and hopefully that will help to speed up the determination process and appease all parties.
OK. Well, I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. Apologies to all those who've got your hands up that are not able to come to you. Our time is up. We managed to squeeze 4 questions in, only just a little bit on housing. I'm sorry it wasn't more. Our hour is over. Thank you very much to, I think it was Stephen Nish who supplied the photographs here of Aberdeen. Love to see those. Remember, we are in Coventry next week. The week after that, we're in Epsom. But for the moment, thank you to the panel. Thank you very much to all of you for being here this evening. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching from Aberdeen. Bye-bye.